Hello and welcome to Nap to History, a quiet space where we slow down and let the past unfold one soft story at a time. Tonight we'll gently explore what it might have been like to find yourself imprisoned in a medieval dungeon, not to frighten or disturb, but to understand the human experience across the centuries. Whether you're lying down for the night or just taking a moment to breathe, I'm really glad you're here. If you find comfort in calm, thoughtful history, feel free to subscribe. There's always another peaceful chapter waiting. Before we begin this journey back in time, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and share if you enjoy calm historical storytelling like this. Let's take a moment to set the stage. Medieval imprisonment was a vastly different experience from what we might imagine today. The period we're exploring spans roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, an era when the concept of rehabilitation was virtually unknown, and prisons served primarily as holding places before trial, punishment, or execution. The medieval justice system was a complex web of feudal obligations, church law, and royal decree, where your fate often depended more on your social status than the nature of your alleged crime. Imagine, if you will, awakening in the dim half-light of dawn, the cold stone beneath you seeping through whatever rough clothing you might be wearing. Your eyes adjust slowly to the gloom, and you begin to make sense of your surroundings. The air is thick with moisture and carries the unmistakable scent of damp stone, unwashed bodies, and the acrid smell of waste. Above you, perhaps 20 feet high, a small barred window allows in just enough light to reveal the harsh reality of your situation. The walls around you are constructed of massive stone blocks, fitted together with such precision that escape seems impossible. These stones, quarried from local sources and shaped by skilled masons, have stood for decades or perhaps centuries, housing countless souls before you. The mortar between them has darkened with age and moisture, and in some places you might notice the faint scratches and markings left by previous occupants. Crude calendars marking days, initials carved with smuggled tools, or perhaps a prayer scratched desperately into the unforgiving surface. Your cell, if it can be called that, might be nothing more than a small chamber carved from the foundation of a castle, monastery, or town hall. Medieval prisons were not purpose-built institutions as we know them today, but rather makeshift holding areas created within existing structures. The space available to you could be as small as 6 feet by 8 feet, barely enough room to lie down with your legs extended, or it might be a larger communal area, shared with a dozen or more fellow prisoners. The floor beneath you is likely bare stone, perhaps covered with a thin layer of straw that serves as both bedding and a meager attempt at absorbing the dampness that perpetually seeps through the walls. This straw, if you're fortunate enough to have it, might be changed weekly or monthly, depending on the benevolence of your captors and the customs of the particular institution holding you. More often, it remains unchanged for months, becoming a breeding ground for vermin and disease. As your senses fully awaken, you become aware of the sounds that define this underground world. There's the constant drip of water somewhere in the darkness, a rhythmic reminder of the world above, where rain falls freely and streams flow toward distant seas. You hear the scurrying of rats, those eternal companions of medieval prisoners, creatures that have learned to thrive in these forgotten spaces beneath the civilized world. From nearby cells, if there are any, comes the occasional cough, groan, or whispered prayer from other unfortunate souls sharing your predicament. The temperature in your stone chamber remains relatively constant throughout the year. Cool in summer, brutally cold in winter. The thick stone walls that imprison you also provide some insulation from the extremes of weather above, but they never truly warm. Your breath might be visible in the colder months, and the dampness seems to settle into your very bones, a persistent reminder of your separation from the warm hearths and comfortable beds of the free world above. Understanding how you might have arrived in this situation requires us to consider the various paths that led people to medieval imprisonment. Perhaps you were a common criminal, accused of theft in a society where taking even a loaf of bread could result in severe punishment. The medieval world was one of scarcity for most people, and property crimes were taken very seriously by authorities who saw any challenge to the established order as a threat to stability itself. Your crime might have been debt, a surprisingly common reason for imprisonment in medieval times. Unlike today, where debt is largely a civil matter, medieval society often treated unpaid obligations as criminal offences. Merchants who defaulted on loans, craftsmen who couldn't pay their guild fees, or peasants who fell behind on their feudal obligations might all find themselves confined until payment could be arranged, or until they worked off their debt through forced labour. Political prisoners were also common in medieval dungeons. Perhaps you spoke out against the local lord, supported the wrong claimant to a throne, or were simply in the wrong place when political winds shifted. Medieval politics were notoriously unstable, with alliances changing rapidly and yesterday's allies becoming today's enemies. A casual comment supporting a rival noble or a perceived slight against authority could land you in chains faster than you might imagine possible. Religious offences were another path to imprisonment. In an age where church and state were inextricably linked, heresy, blasphemy, or even failure to pay church tithes could result in confinement. The medieval church wielded enormous temporal power, and its courts could order imprisonment just as readily as secular authorities. Perhaps you questioned church doctrine, practiced forbidden rituals, or simply failed to show proper deference to religious authority. If you were a woman, your path to imprisonment might have been even more precarious. Accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or simply being too independent or outspoken could result in confinement. Medieval society had very specific expectations for women's behavior, and stepping outside these bounds, even slightly, could have serious consequences. Women prisoners often faced additional hardships and were particularly vulnerable to abuse by guards and fellow prisoners. Your daily routine in this medieval prison would be dictated by the rhythms of the natural world above and the arbitrary schedules of your captors. Dawn might be marked by the distant sound of church bells calling the faithful to morning prayers, a reminder of the spiritual life continuing in the world you've been separated from. The first meal of the day, if it comes at all, would likely be a thin gruel or a crust of bread, perhaps accompanied by a cup of weak ale or water of questionable quality. Medieval prisoners were entirely dependent on charity for their sustenance. Families of prisoners were expected to provide food, clothing, and other necessities, leading to a stark disparity between the treatment of rich and poor prisoners. If you came from a wealthy family, you might enjoy relatively comfortable conditions, better food, clean straw, perhaps even books or writing materials to help pass the time. Your family might pay the jailer for small privileges like additional blankets, candles for light, or permission to receive visitors. However, if you were poor and friendless, your situation would be far more desperate. Medieval society operated on the principle that the poor deserved their fate, and little thought was given to providing even basic sustenance to imprisoned paupers. You might survive on scraps thrown to you by more fortunate prisoners, or on the occasional charitable offerings brought by religious organizations who saw caring for prisoners as a Christian duty. The concept of prisoner rights, as we understand them today, simply didn't exist in medieval times. Prisoners were considered to have forfeited their place in civilized society and were treated accordingly. Physical punishment was common and arbitrary. You might be beaten for speaking too loudly, for failing to show proper respect to guards, or simply because a jailer was in a bad mood. Torture was not only legal, but considered a legitimate tool for extracting confessions or information. Your interactions with other prisoners would form a crucial part of your daily existence. Medieval prisons often housed a diverse mix of people, debtors, alongside murderers, political prisoners next to common thieves, men and women sometimes confined in the same spaces. This mixing created its own social dynamics and hierarchies. Experienced prisoners might take newcomers under their wing, teaching them the unwritten rules of survival, or they might prey upon the weak and naive. In larger prisons, informal leadership structures often emerged. A particularly charismatic or physically powerful prisoner might assume the role of spokesman for the group, negotiating with guards for better conditions or mediating disputes between inmates. These prison leaders often had to walk a fine line between advocating for their fellow prisoners and maintaining the cooperation of their captors. The psychological effects of medieval imprisonment were profound and often overlooked by contemporary authorities. The combination of uncertainty about your fate, physical discomfort, poor nutrition, and social isolation could quickly break even strong spirits. Many prisoners experienced what we might now recognize as depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges, but medieval understanding of such conditions was limited at best. Religious faith provided the primary source of psychological comfort for many medieval prisoners. The Church taught that suffering in this life could lead to redemption in the next, and many prisoners threw themselves into prayer and religious devotion as a way of coping with their circumstances. Some prisons had chaplains who would visit regularly to provide spiritual guidance and comfort, while others relied on fellow prisoners to maintain religious observances. The passage of time in a medieval prison took on a different quality than in the outside world. Without clocks, calendars, or regular schedules, days could blend together into an endless succession of dim dawns and dark nights. Some prisoners tried to maintain their sanity by creating makeshift calendars, scratching marks on walls, or keeping track of meals to mark the passage of days and weeks. Seasonal changes became important markers of time's passage. The slight warming of your cell in summer, or the brutal cold of winter, served as crude calendars. Religious holidays, marked by changes in the food provided by charitable organizations, or by the distant sound of celebrations in the town above, provided additional temporal landmarks in an otherwise timeless existence. The uncertainty surrounding your eventual fate was perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of medieval imprisonment. Trials could be delayed for months or years, particularly if you lacked the resources to pay for legal representation or to bribe court officials. Some prisoners spent years in confinement, awaiting trials that never came, their cases lost in bureaucratic confusion or simply forgotten by overwhelmed legal systems. Medieval justice was often swift but arbitrary. Your trial, when it finally came, might last only minutes and be conducted by officials with little legal training. Evidence was often limited to witness testimony, which could be easily influenced by social status, personal relationships, or simple prejudice. The concept of presumed innocence was foreign to medieval legal thinking. If you were arrested and imprisoned, it was assumed you had probably done something wrong, even if the specific charges couldn't be proven. Physical conditions in your medieval prison would vary dramatically depending on location, time period, and the resources available to your captors. The most notorious prisons were often located in the lower levels of castles or fortified towers, places originally designed for storage rather than human habitation. These spaces were typically windowless, ventilation was poor, and the risk of floods during heavy rains was constant. Some prisoners were fortunate enough to be held in converted rooms within castle complexes, spaces that might have originally served as storage areas or servants' quarters. These rooms, while still confining, often had better light and ventilation than purpose-built dungeon cells. Windows, even if barred, provided not only light, but also a connection to the outside world that could be psychologically vital for maintaining sanity. The Tower of London, perhaps the most famous medieval prison, housed prisoners in various conditions, depending on their social status and the nature of their crimes. High-ranking political prisoners might be confined in relatively comfortable rooms within the tower complex, complete with furniture, books, and regular meals. Common criminals, however, faced far harsher conditions in the tower's lower levels, spaces that were cold, damp, and barely fit for human habitation. Disease was a constant threat in medieval prisons. The combination of poor sanitation, malnutrition, overcrowding, and limited medical care created ideal conditions for the spread of various illnesses. Dysentery, typhus, and plague could sweep through prison populations with devastating effect. Many prisoners who survived their initial crimes and trials succumbed to disease before they could be released or executed. The medical care available to prisoners was minimal at best. Some larger prisons might have arrangements with local physicians or barber surgeons to provide basic medical attention, but this was more the exception than the rule. Most prisoners had to rely on folk remedies, the limited medical knowledge of fellow inmates, or simple prayer for healing. Serious injuries or illnesses were often tantamount to death sentences. Personal hygiene in medieval prisons was a constant challenge. Access to clean water was limited, and bathing facilities were virtually non-existent. Prisoners might go months or even years without a proper bath, leading to skin diseases, infestations of lice and other parasites, and the persistent odors that characterized medieval prison environments. The lack of clean clothing meant that garments became increasingly ragged and filthy over time. Despite these harsh conditions, human ingenuity and resilience often found ways to adapt and survive. Prisoners developed informal systems for sharing resources, with those who had more helping those who had less. Experienced inmates taught newcomers how to find the warmest spots in cells, how to catch and prepare rats for food when official rations ran low, and how to maintain some semblance of dignity and humanity in dehumanizing conditions. Entertainment and mental stimulation in medieval prisons came from simple sources. Prisoners might tell stories, sing songs, or recite poetry from memory to help pass the long hours. Those who could read and write sometimes created their own entertainment by composing verses or keeping journals, scratching their words onto walls or scraps of available material. Games could be fashioned from stones, straw, or whatever materials were at hand. The social dynamics within prison walls often reflected the broader social structures of medieval society. Noble prisoners, even in confinement, expected and often received deference from prisoners of lower social status. However, the shared experience of imprisonment could sometimes break down these social barriers, creating unlikely friendships and alliances between people who would never have associated in the outside world. Religious observance provided structure and meaning to prison life for many inmates. Daily prayers, the celebration of religious holidays, and the sharing of religious stories helped maintain connection to the spiritual community beyond the prison walls. Some prisoners emerged from their confinement with deepened faith, viewing their suffering as a test or purification that brought them closer to divine understanding. The relationship between prisoners and their guards was complex and varied greatly, depending on individual personalities and circumstances. Some guards were brutal and arbitrary in their treatment of prisoners, viewing their charges as less than human and deserving whatever suffering befell them. Others, particularly those who had served in their positions for many years, might develop more nuanced relationships with prisoners, recognizing their shared humanity even within the constraints of the prison system. Corruption was endemic in medieval prison systems. Guards routinely accepted bribes for better treatment, additional food, or small privileges. Those with money could often purchase significantly better conditions, while the poor suffered in the worst possible circumstances. This system of corruption, while morally questionable, sometimes provided the only path to survival for prisoners who might otherwise have perished from neglect. Escape attempts, while rare, were not unknown in medieval prisons. The massive stone construction of most facilities made physical escape extremely difficult, but prisoners sometimes succeeded through elaborate tunneling projects, bribery of guards, or taking advantage of unusual circumstances, like fires or attacks on the prison facility. Most escape attempts, however, ended in failure and resulted in even harsher treatment for the prisoners involved. The psychological impact of failed escape attempts could be devastating. The crushing of hope, combined with the inevitable punishment that followed, often broke prisoners' spirits more effectively than the original harsh conditions. Successful escapes, on the other hand, became legendary within prison communities, providing inspiration and hope to other inmates, even when their own situations seemed hopeless. Communication with the outside world was strictly limited, but not always impossible. Some prisoners were allowed to receive visits from family members, though these visits were typically brief, closely supervised, and often required payment to guards. Letters could sometimes be smuggled in or out of prisons, though discovery of such correspondence usually resulted in severe punishment for all involved. As we've explored the daily reality of medieval imprisonment, we begin to understand how such experiences shaped not only the individuals who endured them, but also the societies that created and maintained these systems. The medieval prison was a reflection of broader social values, the importance of hierarchy, the belief in divine justice, and the conviction that suffering could serve redemptive purposes. Many prisoners who survived their confinement emerged profoundly changed by the experience. Some found that their suffering had deepened their spiritual understanding and commitment to religious life. Others became advocates for prison reform or devoted their lives to helping other prisoners and outcasts. Still others were broken by their experiences and struggled to readjust to life in the outside world. The families of prisoners also suffered during these ordeals. The loss of a breadwinner could plunge entire households into poverty, while the social stigma associated with having a family member in prison could affect marriage prospects, business relationships, and social standing for generations. Children of prisoners often face discrimination and limited opportunities, creating cycles of poverty and marginalization that could persist for decades. Medieval prisons served multiple functions beyond simply confining criminals. They were tools of political control, allowing rulers to remove potential threats to their authority. They were instruments of economic pressure, forcing debtors to pay what they owed or work off their obligations. They were symbols of royal or ecclesiastical power, visible reminders of the consequences of challenging established authority. The location of prisons within medieval communities was carefully considered. Castle dungeons, while secure, were often isolated from the broader community. Town prisons, on the other hand, were typically located in central areas where they could serve as constant reminders to citizens of the price of lawbreaking. The public nature of medieval justice meant that prisons were not hidden away, but were visible parts of the urban landscape. Different types of prisoners required different approaches to confinement. Political prisoners, particularly those of noble birth, often received treatment that reflected their social status, even in imprisonment. They might be confined in towers or castle rooms, rather than dungeon cells, allowed to retain servants, and permitted to receive books, writing materials, and other amenities. This differential treatment reflected the medieval understanding that social rank persisted even in confinement. Religious prisoners presented particular challenges for medieval authorities. Monks or clergy who had violated ecclesiastical law might be confined in monastery prisons, which operated under different rules than secular facilities. These religious prisons often emphasized penance and spiritual rehabilitation rather than simple punishment, though the conditions could be equally harsh. Women prisoners faced unique challenges in medieval confinement. Many prisons had no separate facilities for women, leading to situations where female prisoners were housed alongside men, often with predictable and tragic results. Some larger cities maintained separate women's prisons, usually attached to convents or other religious institutions, but these were the exception rather than the rule. The treatment of pregnant prisoners was another area where medieval justice struggled with practical and moral dilemmas. Some authorities would delay executions or harsh punishments until after childbirth, while others showed no such consideration. Children born in prison faced uncertain futures, often becoming wards of the church or being raised within prison walls until they were old enough to fend for themselves. Economic factors played a crucial role in determining the quality of prison life. Wealthy prisoners could afford to hire attorneys, bribe officials, and purchase better conditions. They might even be allowed to serve their sentences under house arrest in their own homes, particularly if they were of noble birth or had powerful connections. Poor prisoners, lacking such resources, faced the full harshness of medieval justice. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life affected prison conditions significantly. Winter brought additional hardships, as heating was minimal and food supplies often ran low. Spring and summer offered some relief, as temperatures rose and fresh food became more available through charitable donations. Religious seasons, particularly Lent and major feast days, could bring temporary improvements in prison conditions as charitable organizations increased their activities. Prison labor was common in many medieval facilities. Prisoners might be put to work on construction projects, manufacturing goods, or performing services for the community. This labor served multiple purposes. It helped offset the costs of maintaining the prison, provided needed goods and services, and was thought to have rehabilitative value, though the medieval understanding of rehabilitation was quite different from modern concepts. The end of imprisonment could come through various means. Some prisoners were eventually tried and either executed or released. Others served specific sentences and were freed when their terms expired. Wealthy prisoners might purchase pardons or have their sentences commuted through political influence. Some died in prison, whether from disease, injury, or simple despair. The reintegration of former prisoners into medieval society was challenging. The stigma of imprisonment followed individuals for life, affecting their ability to find work, marry, or participate fully in community life. Some former prisoners turned to religious life, joining monasteries or convents where their past might be overlooked in favor of spiritual devotion. Others struggled with poverty and social isolation, sometimes turning to crime again in a cycle that was difficult to break. As we've journeyed through this exploration of medieval imprisonment, we've seen how these experiences reflected the values, fears, and limitations of medieval society. The harsh conditions, arbitrary justice, and differential treatment based on social status reveal a world quite different from our own, yet populated by people whose basic human needs for dignity, hope, and connection remained constant across the centuries. The stories of those who endured medieval imprisonment remind us of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of justice systems that recognize the fundamental dignity of all people. While we may never know the names of most who suffered in medieval dungeons, their experiences contributed to the gradual evolution of more humane approaches to justice and the recognition of basic human rights. We hope you found this gentle exploration of a difficult topic both informative and thought-provoking. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps spare a thought for those countless souls who faced the darkness of medieval imprisonment with courage and dignity. Their suffering was not in vain if it helps us build more just and compassionate societies today. The medieval world may seem distant and foreign, but the human experiences we've explored, fear, hope, despair, and resilience, remain constant throughout history. Until next time, sweet dreams, and may you rest peacefully, knowing that you're free to wake tomorrow in a world where justice, while still imperfect, has evolved far beyond the harsh realities of medieval imprisonment.